Week 22, Overview, Charters, Creeds, and the English Civil War. Having studied Massachusetts in detail, let's look at the rest of New England colonies, which were established for a range of reasons. 3 new colonies were settled largely by people who moved out of Massachusetts. New Hampshire lay north of the Massachusetts Bay boundaries, but it was prime real estate, so people soon migrated there. New Haven, which is now in Connecticut, was established as a Puritan theocracy. It eventually joined with 3 other settlements to form Connecticut. Rhode Island was a place for people to escape from Puritan orthodoxy. It wasn't just Puritans who colonized the coast during this period, though. Sweden planted colonies in what is now New Jersey and Delaware, which the Dutch took over. Across the Atlantic, England had a civil war. The Puritans started it. They wanted to worship God according to their understanding of the Bible, not according to Anglican tradition. King Charles I was a little too soft on the Catholics to suit the Puritans. He even granted land to Lord Baltimore to form a refuge for Catholics in Maryland. When Irish Catholics rebelled in 1641, the largely Puritan Parliament didn't trust the king to fight them. One thing led to another, and civil war broke out. King Charles was captured and eventually beheaded. I wish I could say that the righteous rule of the Puritans turned England into a holy nation that shone as a light to the world, but it didn't. After 20 years of Puritan rule, England kicked the Puritans out and restored the monarchy. We can learn a lot by studying the Puritans' failed experiment in theocracy, both in England and New England. These events had a huge impact on the American colonies. Over the course of 70 tumultuous years in England, from 1620 to 1688, Puritans and Royalists went back and forth from being persecuted to being persecutors. As political leadership swung in one direction and then another, various types of people fled England for the colonies, seeking safety and a new start. Thus, America was colonized in waves of English-speaking people who often were very different from one another. You can't just blame the Puritans for the Civil War, though. Charles I made the mistake of trying to rule England as an absolute monarch. That might work in France, but it didn't in England, and it cost him his head. You can't blame Charles for trying, though. His father, James I, had ruled Scotland absolutely. When James came to England, he was unpleasantly surprised at the long-standing limits to his power in the form of the English Parliament, the common law. France didn't have any such traditions to slow the trend towards absolutism. Rather, the French monarch's power had grown unchecked as her central government developed. During the 100 Years' War, the Estates General in France had given kings the power to raise taxes and army at will without convening an assembly. As we read about concurrent events in England and France this week, we'll see how absolutism was firmly routed in England and just as firmly rooted in France during the reign of Louis XIII. Next week, we'll see absolutism come to full flower in France during the long reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. That's getting a little ahead of the story, though. This week, we're going to look at the colonies that were established before the Puritans took control of England. These include the New England colonies of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. Maryland was established as a haven for Catholics around the same time. The Dutch had a small fort at what's now Hartford, Connecticut, but the first permanent European settlement there was made by Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. New England doesn't have many major rivers. The Connecticut River is the one real exception. Settlers from Massachusetts established a number of towns along this navigable river. Without any clear charter to govern them, 3 of these new towns were united in 1636 to form what was called the River Colony, or the Connecticut Colony. Students who are working on the government elective will study the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the New World's first written constitution. It created and defined the government of the colony. Other Massachusetts Puritans founded New Haven as an independent colony which was to be run as a pure theocracy. Soon other towns joined the New Haven colony. The independent New Haven and Connecticut colonies were eventually merged into one under direct control of King Charles II in 1662, but that's getting ahead of the story. We'll get to him next week. There's New Hampshire. New Hampshire's motto is "Live free or die," and its independent spirit goes all the way back to its beginnings. It was founded by freewheeling settlers who were looking to make money or escape from Puritan control. Massachusetts insisted it controlled the territory, but many New Hampshire settlers objected. They agreed to submit to Massachusetts in 1641, were split from Massachusetts in 1679, were reunited in 1686, divided again in 1691. New Hampshire was back under Massachusetts rule in 1698 and separated for the last time in 1741. Maine, further north, didn't escape the rule of Massachusetts until after the American Revolution. That's why it isn't one of the 13 original colonies, even though it is one of the 6 New England states. Neither is Vermont. New York and New Hampshire both claimed that territory for years. Vermont was the first new state to join the Union after a brief stint as the independent Republic of Vermont. These northern territories took a long time to establish their independence from Massachusetts. The colonies to the south were on their own more quickly. We've already seen how Connecticut was formed. The other colony to the south of Massachusetts is Rhode Island. It was largely founded by people who got banished by the Puritans. One of these dissenters was a strong-minded pastor, Roger Williams. He thought the Anglican Church was apostate and believed the Puritans didn't go far enough. He refused to call King James a Christian. These and other opinions got him into trouble with the Massachusetts authorities, who exiled him. They were going to send him back to England on a ship to face the consequences of such talk, but he snuck out of Salem in the middle of the night and hiked through the woods to his Indian friends. In 1636, he founded a new settlement at Providence, on land he bought from the Narragansett Indians. He welcomed people of any religion there, and in time became a Baptist. Williams was soon followed by other refugees from Massachusetts. Anne Hutchinson was banished in 1638 for leading a Bible study that included men, for criticizing the Puritan leaders, and for claiming that God spoke directly to her soul. We'll learn more about what happened to her in week 24. She helped found Portsmouth on the island now known as Rhode Island. In 1647, that settlement united with Providence and 2 other towns to form Rhode Island and Providence plantations. Rhode Island was unique in allowing anybody to worship as they chose. There's evidence of a Jewish community in Newport as early as 1658, long before any other European community had any thoughts of treating Jews as fellow citizens. Maryland was another diverse colony. The Maryland Religious Toleration Act of 1649 was the first document of its kind stating that settlers had the right to worship freely. Unlike Rhode Island, though, Maryland limited its toleration to Trinitarian Christians. The land for this new colony was granted by King Charles to Lord Baltimore, an Irish Catholic, who named his new colony Maryland after Henrietta Maria, the Princess of France who had become Charles's Catholic wife. Lord Baltimore's grant included some land already settled by a foreign power, Sweden, which had a post at what is now Wilmington, Delaware. England wasn't the only country settling the eastern seaboard. Sweden planted the first settlements in what are now New Jersey and Delaware. New Sweden didn't last long, though. All their colonies were taken over by the Dutch Republic. Holland was becoming a major sea power at this time. Before long, half of Europe's ships would fly the Dutch flag. They claimed much of the mid-Atlantic territory, including New Amsterdam, built on Manhattan Island, which the Dutch bought from Indians for $24 worth of beads and such, and parts of what is now Connecticut. Let's leave America behind now to consider the English Civil War. King Charles I was not a gifted leader. Although he was raised in Scotland, a hotbed of Calvinism, he never really knew how to deal with the Puritans. He didn't like dealing with Parliament either. As you may know, back then, the British Parliament only came together when the king called it, usually for the purpose of raising money. Only Parliament can enact a tax, and it usually did so only after airing its grievances with the king's rule. Charles didn't want any of this, so he got very creative with his financing. He imposed things he called levies, benevolences, duties, and so forth. Many Englishmen thought his money-making methods were taxes, no matter what he called them, and they refused to pay. Under the Magna Carta, they had a right to trial by a jury of their peers, where they could raise the defense that these were unlawful taxes. Charles knew that an English jury might not convict a man for refusing to pay an unlawful tax, so he kept tax protesters out of the traditional courts and sent them to courts without juries, martial law courts, admiralty courts, or the court of the Star Chamber. Widespread discontent grew. He got by with his non-traditional methods until he tried to make Scotch Protestants adopt the English Book of Common Prayer. That was too Catholic for the Scots, who rioted and tried to stone the Bishop of Edinburgh. They adopted a national covenant which opposed any move towards Catholicism. These Covenanters fought English troops in what were called the Bishops' Wars in 1639 and 1640. England lost the First Bishops' War and had to pay damages to Scotland. That bankrupted Charles, so he finally had to assemble a parliament. The first parliament he called didn't give him any money, and he dissolved it within a month. He still needed cash, so he assembled another parliament, which made him agree to a law that said that only Parliament could dissolve itself. Englishmen called this parliament the Long Parliament because, although it was called in 1640, it was not officially dissolved for 20 years. The Long Parliament started off by abolishing the special courts the king had used to evade the Magna Carta. Then, when Irish Catholics rebelled, Parliament didn't trust Charles to lead the fight against them. Charles ordered 5 leading members of Parliament impeached, but Parliament refused to surrender them. The king sent troops into the House of Commons to arrest them, and war broke out. Charles was badly outnumbered in London, so he fled to the provinces. Parliament began raising its own army. The Royalists had the better cavalry. They were known as the Cavaliers, from the French word chevalier, or for horseman. Parliament had better infantry. Their forces were known as the Roundheads, because the troops cut their hair short to fit inside their steel helmets. The two sides battled through 1642 and 1643. The Scotch Covenanters joined the battle on Parliament's side in 1644, and then a man named Oliver Cromwell began to assemble a full-time professional army called the New Model Army, which eventually overwhelmed royal resistance. King Charles surrendered to Scotch forces in 1646. From the beginning of the conflict, the Puritans insisted they were loyal to their king and were just trying to save him from wicked advisers. This became problematic once the king was in custody without any advisers to blame. Charles escaped, and war broke out again. The New Model Army smashed the opposition, and the soldiers demanded that Charles be punished. King Charles was put on trial for treason against the Constitution and people of England. He made no defense. He defied the jurisdiction of the court, simply asking, "By what right do you try your king?" Charles was beheaded in 1649. The Puritan goal was to complete what England's Reformation had begun, to reshape Anglican worship, to introduce effective church discipline into Anglican parishes, to establish righteousness in the political, domestic, and economic fields, to convert all Englishmen to a vigorous evangelical faith. I wish we had time to go into the sad but important story of the Puritan takeover of England. Suffice it to say, it didn't work. John Owen, one of the finest of the Puritans, reflected on what went wrong. He pointed to Romans 8:13, which says, "If you live according to the flesh, you will die, but if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live." After the Puritans lost power, Owen zeroed in on 3 all-important words in that verse: by the Spirit. According to Owen, the Puritans failed because they tried to mortify the flesh by means of the flesh, using secular tools like the government and the law. The rise and fall of the English Puritans affected who moved to America. Each new wave of immigrants brought special talents and viewpoints to America and contributed much to its rich and varied culture, opinions, and the growth of this new nation. What's amazing in hindsight is that the people who were on opposite sides of the English Civil War could eventually come together on the other side of the Atlantic to form a new nation in 1776. We'll follow that thread of God's tapestry in more detail in Unit 4.